Good evening. Let me begin by saying not only thank you to Richard and the staff at St. Bennett's for this invitation, but extend to each of you my warmest wishes for your current well-being. It is certainly a time when being well cannot be taken for granted. On top of a global pandemic of historic proportions, we as a collective society have had to come to grips, more recently, with racial inequalities and injustices that have persisted for far too long. Both have threatened and challenged the very structure of our world, taking lives and leaving a wake of destruction that has impacted virtually every aspect of everyone's life. To borrow a phrase from one of my teachers and mentors in a recent op-ed article, quote, "I can't breathe writes itself across mass demonstrations at a moment of mass death by a disease that kills by asphyxiation." In other words, there is an eerie and deep resonance between the ways that COVID-19 and racism takes lives. In fact, we might do well to ask how this apocalyptic moment, and here I'm calling upon this term's etymology of unveiling or revealing, might help us to see more clearly the persistence of an unjust status quo. And, in so doing, challenge us to refuse to return to any sense of normal that is economically, racially, ecologically, or otherwise unsustainable. All of which is, coincidentally, not unrelated to what I've been asked to speak about tonight. As some of you know, earlier this year I published my first monograph, Deconstructing Undecidability, Derrida, Justice, and Religious Discourse. Part of what I'm exploring in this book is the complicated pursuit of justice and how it's always entangled with complex issues of identity and exclusivity. So for instance, part of what I ask in the book is, can I be committed to justice without modifier or exclusion or condition? Or must the pursuit of justice always be more concrete, more specific and particular than that? In fact, more exclusive. And what are the implications in the pursuit of justice? Again, to draw on a current example that I use in the book, part of it is the difference between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. While the former might not necessarily contradict the latter might continue to obstruct the former. In other words, saying and standing for all lives in a situation where some are valued less than others perpetuates the problem. Thus, in order to rectify the problem, with the goal of valuing all lives, there needs to be particular focus on some lives. For most of us, especially in the current moment, there doesn't appear to be much controversy there. In fact, the Black Lives Matter movement around the world is impressing upon more and more of us, or impressing on us more emphatically, how important such stances are. Yes, Black lives do matter, and because they have not mattered, we need to protest, march, advocate, and be in solidarity with movements that ensure they do matter. Unfortunately, however, this is not the only form of injustice that persists in our society. Cases can and have been made about the lack of value attributed to other lives. Women's, transgender, queer, homeless, disabled, immigrant, and non-human lives have, unfortunately, been systemically undervalued and even devalued in our society, not to mention other ethnic and religious bodies. And the list of who and how so goes on and on. Moreover, the Black Lives Matter protests around the world have not gone on without scrutiny. From destruction of property, businesses, and monuments, to the lack of focus on other lives and livelihoods at stake, to even the way in which mass protests continue to risk further spreads of coronavirus, and hence put precarious bodies in jeopardy, all of which offers an enticing opportunity to critique how this movement, or action, or protest falls short, is incomplete or impure, perpetuates other injustices and issues, etc. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the book is take a more honest assessment of this complicated predicament. What role does picking and choosing play, standing up for this or that, in the pursuit of justice? The Black Lives Matter movement demonstrates the importance and necessity of standing up for, choosing to focus on this particular issue, this particular form of justice, precisely because of the unjust status quo that does not. Intervening when violence is inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes, struggling to imagine and create a world free of anti-Blackness, where every Black person has the social, economic, and political power to thrive. Fortunately, it has recently gained traction and widespread support, leading to those previously unaware of and not as concerned about such issues to get involved. Support on social media and joining in protests, donating and raising awareness, even beginning to impact political sensibilities and opinions. But this movement has been hyper-focused on this issue for much longer than the last 3 weeks. It even predates the Black Lives Matter movement that began in 2013 with the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. It goes back to the early slave revolts, where Africans resisted being bought and sold and treated as property, to 19th century movements that demanded the United States make good on its promises to emancipate its slaves, through 20th century resistance to the backlash of white supremacy. Because of its widespread attention, this moment offers all of us an opportunity to take a stand, to protest, to speak the truth, testifying to justice in the midst of injustice. It is an opportunity to critically examine how society views Black bodies. It is an opportunity to examine constructions of whiteness and its implied supremacy, as well as the privilege that accompanies it. It is an opportunity to take a stand and resist the temptation to remain on the sidelines, to choose to support Black lives and resist anti-Black racism. And while some note that this moment feels different, has a uniqueness and impact that might lead to more substantive change, there is always the risk that momentum will fade. Hopefully it lasts and is the beginning of a new normal, but once the protests slow down and social media shifts its attention elsewhere, there will be ample opportunity for many of us to be distracted, even to focus on other issues and forms of injustice. But it does not mean the issue will go away or become less important, that it will not continue to demand decisive focus and priority. What I'm ultimately arguing in this book is that such decisions and choices are inescapable. In other words, it's not a matter of whether or not to choose, but what choices are we making? We might, and hopefully will, in this current moment, decide to support Black Lives Matter right now. But this raises the question, what did I support previously? And if and when I lose focus on Black Lives Matter, what will I be choosing to support? Because indecision might be tacit support for the unjust status quo whose ideology does not support or value Black lives. I begin the book with a quote from Martin Buber. If there were a devil, he would not be the one who decided against God, but he that in all eternity did not decide. Part of what I'm trying to do in this book is root out what I'm calling the devil of indecision. And this is especially pertinent for those of us who inhabit a privileged perspective, who do not have to get our hands dirty with the messy and complicated work of activism, difficult decisions, and civic engagement. Those of us whose lives are not on the line and not at risk. In this book, I argue that indecision is a product of power and privilege, the mistaken illusion that we might be able to avoid the difficult decision. I further argue that the only remedy is vigilant, pervasive reflection on the kinds of power and privilege that each of us complexly inhabit. So again, how might this current apocalyptic moment reveal our positions of power and our privileged perspectives? And how might this revelation lead us to confront the decisions that we are always already making? Because, in the words of our former head of college, Werner Jeanron, indecision remains an illusion, we must decide. In which case, who or what are we supporting? What is our implicit protest or stand? What have we chosen to endorse?